3, down verse 11, 12. Now what happened in chapter 1? Briefly. Vashti got kicked out. That's pretty concise description, yeah. And right at the end is a verse or two about Mordecai overhears at the king's gate a conspiracy that later, just as luck would have it, plays right into our story, so don't forget that. In chapter 3 so far, Haman, who is the prime minister, shall we say, second only to King Xerxes, passes by Mordecai, who refuses to bow, and that was one of the orders of the king, was that all who come in contact with Mordecai are to bow. And he was deeply offended by Mordecai's refusal to bow. And we're in the first 6 verses, by the way. And he resolves, then and there, I'm going to get rid of Mordecai. And not only that, I'm going to get rid of all Jews everywhere throughout the Persian Empire. And that's where we pick it up at verse, I think we got to around verse 4, which tells us of the decree that he talked the king Xerxes into issuing. Now, what one minor fact did he not tell the king when he asked him to approve this decree?
Which people it was.
Which people it was that you want to exterminate out of my kingdom. You know, if you go killing the king's subjects by the thousands, you reduce his tax base. Okay? And you would think the king would be jealous over his constituents, presumably loyal constituents. But Xerxes never bothered to ask Mordecai, well, who are these people that you're going to exterminate on one day? Remember, he cast lots to find out which was the best day for this one day for the Jews to all be killed throughout the Persian Empire. And the date was about 11 months in the future, which it was next spring. So that's where we are in verse 12, as the decree of extermination is formulated by Haman. The date, by the way, is April 474 BC. And Haman summons in his royal secretaries to dictate the decree and make sure that it gets sent throughout the Persian Empire as quickly as possible in verse 13. And the decree ordered the people to kill all the Jews, including their women and their children, on a single day. And then what else were they to do after they murdered all the Jews? Steal, take, plunder, loot their property, take everything that they had. Meanwhile, verse 15, Haman and the king, after this was instituted and the decree was sent out on horseback to all ends of the kingdom, and many thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people were due to be murdered, what do? They sit down to have a drink in the city of Susa. While the city of Susa was in an uproar, by the way, that's right here. And that's where all of this takes place. So they just sit down and have a drink and don't even seem to be concerned about what Mordecai, at least the king doesn't seem to be concerned about what Mordecai has just done. And the people of Susa were probably scratching their heads wondering, well, if this decree, which I have just gotten, which the people of the city of Susa would get first, calls for the extermination of the Jews, and you're another minority, what might you think? Who's next? Because he didn't even, as far as I know, the decree didn't say why. It just said, kill them all in one day next spring. Oh, yes.
Good party,
And lots of parties. And what?
Lots of entertainment.
Yes. He was not overly concerned with the fate of his constituents at all.
Someone who lets somebody else do on that.
Yes, he wanted somebody else to handle all the details. And he's going to do that again. He's going to do that again. We could, I guess, if we were going to be generous, call Xerxes a good delegator. And I think that is being a little bit generous. So,
He already figured out he's not a good military commander.
no, because he has just gotten defeated between the year 481 and 479 BC by the Greeks pretty soundly. So, okay, any questions on Esther chapter 3? Okay, we've got the decree going out everywhere, and the king and Haman sitting down to have a drink. Chapter 4. On hearing of the decree, Mordecai, whose name was on that decree probably in the first spot, in the number 1 spot, put on sackcloth and ashes and went about in great grief, not only for himself, but for who? All of his fellow Jews. It could have been that he wanted to find some way to attract Esther's attention by going about the king's gate out there dressed like that and wailing. And you've seen Middle Eastern people, how they wail, how they mourn and weep in public. So it's bound to get your attention. And I found this interesting little tidbit. Persian law prohibited anyone clothed in sackcloth to go into the king. In other words, don't bring me any bad news. That seems to be the point of it. And in a similar vein, Nehemiah said that he had never been sad in King Artaxerxes, who is Artaxerxes' son later, and we'll see this. He said, I had never been sad in the king's presence before, and when asked about it, Xerxes says when asked about it by Xerxes, he was overwhelmed with fear. So that's Nehemiah 2:1-2. So the king didn't want anybody coming in dressed and with that kind of attitude or kind of a problem. Verse 3 tells us that the Jews, upon hearing of this terrible decree, mourned throughout the empire, which is very understandable. And when Esther heard what Mordecai was doing, the report of his wailing and sackcloth got to her in verse 4. So she sends him a change of clothes, which will enable him to do what? Come inside to the palace to see the king or her. Mordecai refused the queen's kind offer. In verse 5, she sent her trusted aide, Hathach, is the way to pronounce it, to find out what was wrong, what was troubling her legal guardian, Mordecai, that he would do such a thing. And Mordecai told Hathach about the decree, and he even gave him a copy of it, so that he could take it to Esther, and she could see the proof herself of the decree. And then he instructed Hathach to urge Esther to seek an audience as soon as you can with the queen to plead for mercy for her people. She was the only one. Remember, it was the prime minister, the second in command, that got this decree issued. The only hope for her and the Jewish people was herself. But Mordecai's request for her to go into the king would require that she reveal what about herself? That she's Jewish, which Mordecai had made clear. Don't reveal that fact to anyone. Verse 9, Mordecai's message is delivered to Esther about what's going on out here. Esther's dilemma. She sent a note back and said, by the way, you know that you want me to go in to see the king immediately. But if I go in there and he does not approve of me or does not want to see me, you know what happens to me. I die then and there on the spot. Why do you think a king would have a rule like that?
He can. Because he
But, well, that's one reason, because he
Cut
can.
down traffic.
Huh?
Cut down traffic.
And cut down the noise. But Persian kings, as we saw with Israel's northern kingdom, they were plagued by assassination plots. We've already seen Mordecai uncover one of those. And it's odd that Xerxes is going to be assassinated later on in his reign in 465. So, you don't come into the king's presence without an invitation. And the guards make sure that that is enforced. So she stands out there, and thankfully he approves of her and holds out the scepter, and she touches the scepter and is accepted by the king. Now, Esther had not seen the king in 30 days, and that caused her some concern that perhaps she had fallen out of favor with Xerxes. I told you a lot of these women were just left there. Verse 13 through 15, Mordecai's reply was for Esther to be courageous, and being queen would not protect her from this decree because she was Jewish too. She faced a situation that I'm going to die if this decree isn't reversed, or I'm going to die if he refuses to see me. So I'm going to die one way or the other, so I might as well go in and see if there's anything I can do about it. Hopefully he will accept me and listen to my plea. Mordecai said, if you remain silent during this crisis, God will find some other way to save us, and you and your family, and he didn't include himself, but we're all going to die. And he said, God has raised her. Who knows what God has not raised you up to the position you're in for his glory and to save your people. Verses 15 through 16, Esther replies to Mordecai to mobilize the Jews and to fast and to pray for 3 days for her when she goes in to the king. But she was very aware that she was going to disobey directly the king's decree not to come in without approval. I guess she thought it was better to do her duty and die for her people than refuse to do her duty and die with her people. So she really, it was in a difficult situation here. And in verse 17, Mordecai did as Esther asked him to do, that is, get the Jews together and pray that this will go well with me when I go in to the court. Chapter 5. Esther goes and stands at the entrance of the court, in the palace's inner court. Can you imagine how she must have felt standing there? Said, this next 34 breaths might be my last ones. And nobody would question the king, by the way. That's just the way things were. But thankfully, he held at his scepter, which amounted to a pardon for coming in here unannounced. That's what it was, pardon. Verse 3, he asked Queen Esther, what do you want? I'll give you whatever you want, even unto half of my kingdom. Was he being truthful there with that offer? No, not really. That was just a kind of a Eastern Oriental custom that of being nice and say, I'll give you anything you ask within reason. You remember Herod the king, when Salome danced before him, asked her, what do you want? I'll give you anything up to half of my kingdom. So it was still a common phrase, that's in Mark 6:23, or I'll do whatever you ask if it's within reason. And I guess he realized that the only reason that she would be here is something important, because I'm aware of the risk that she realizes that she has taken. Her request, I want you and Haman to come and eat with me tomorrow, a banquet that I have prepared myself. And he must have been scratching his head. She risked her life to ask me out to eat? Really? So I guess his curiosity was piqued very much. Mine would have been. And she wanted to make sure Haman was there. And we'll find out why she wanted Haman there, or at least I think so. Verse 5, the king quickly accepted Esther's invitation to the banquet, gave out an order to send Haman here immediately, and he and the prime minister went to the banquet the next day, and he and Haman finished eating and were relaxing in verse 6, again drinking together, and he asked again the same question. What is it that you want, Esther? I will give anything you ask, even up to half of my kingdom. She asked him and Haman to attend another banquet, another one the next day, and I promise then I will tell you what my request is. Haman left the banquet very, very happy. He felt that he was honored because only two people were invited to the queen's banquet, the king and himself. And I would have felt the same way. There was three people at this banquet, and I was one of them. And I am sure that he assumed that Esther thought the world of him, held him in the highest esteem by inviting him to a banquet that previously only had the king and the queen there. And in light of that, and because of the honor granted to him to be invited to this very exclusive banquet, his ego began to grow even more than it was before. But in verse 9, he noticed that when he left, Mordecai refused to bow down to him again. That is, when he got out there to the king's gate. Now, the king's gate was where Mordecai exercised his office on behalf of the king. And of course, he had refused to bow back in chapter 3, verse 5 once already, and this was the second time he had refused. However, Haman was able to restrain himself this time and not lose his temper, and he decided, I'm just going to go ahead and go home. In verses 11 through 14, he gets home and calls all of his friends together for, guess what? A banquet, or a drinking party, if you prefer. Probably to relieve himself of his rage against Mordecai. Perhaps my friends and my relatives can take my mind off of this, because he was still angry and boiling about Mordecai's refusal to show him the honor that he felt was due him. He boasted about his wealth in verse 11, his children, the honor given him, his promotion, and the recognition and honor given him by Esther when she invited him to that dinner. His wife and his friends' advice in verse 14. I'll tell you what you need to do to get rid of this guy that's really making you angry and putting you under all kinds of stress. Why don't you go out and build a gallows 75 feet high and have Mordecai hanged on it? Why would you want a gallows, or actually it was a stake? It was not a Clint Eastwood gallows. It was a stake, and they impaled the poor victim on this thing. But why 75 feet high?
So everyone can see it.
What?
So everyone can see it.
So everybody could see what power and authority Haman exercised, and to get rid of his frustration with the way he felt he was not being honored enough by Mordecai. They said, ask the king the next day to hang Mordecai on this gallows that you're going to have built tonight, and then go to dinner and be happy. Haman, verse 14, he loved the idea, because this gets rid of the guy that's just driving me crazy. Now, Haman wasn't greedy, was he? What was his problem? Huh? His ego. His ego was his main problem. He had plenty of money. Remember, he offered to pay 375 tons of silver for the cost of this expedition to murder the Jews in 11 months. So apparently money was not a problem, but ego was a huge problem with Haman. Any questions? We're moving along smartly. Chapter 6. Notice the first few words of your translation, that this is the very same night. We're not tomorrow, we are that same night. Haman has instructed his underlings to go out and build this gallows. Haman wants to go in as early and quickly as possible and get permission from the king to carry out the execution of Mordecai, because Mordecai was one of the king's officials, not nearly as high ranking, of course, as Haman, but nevertheless. Now, it was the night before Esther's second banquet. And the king, couldn't sleep. And Betty and I have done this before. When we can't sleep, we'll go into the living room and sit down in a chair and grab something to read. Because that will put you, at least Betty and I, put you to sleep sooner or later, at least make you groggy enough to where if you go back to bed, you can sleep. And guess what he wants to do? Bring me the royal records, and guess which record he brings? The one that contains the account of Mordecai, back at the end of chapter 2, I believe, where he saved the king from an assassination plot by exposing it. And the king asked, well, what was done for Mordecai? And it was their custom that if somebody did something special for the king did return that favor and honored that person. And of course, Mordecai certainly deserved some sort of recognition for saving Xerxes' life. So he picks, just by coincidence and dumb luck, the volume that's got the account of Mordecai saving the king's life. And he learned that there has been a terrible miscarriage of justice, because Mordecai still has not been honored for what he did for me. That was about 5 years ago, by the way. Happened about 5 years ago. Yes.
So you were talking last weekend, something I didn't really realize. God is never really mentioned.
No.
And I didn't realize that before. But then again, you know, what Mordecai says to Esther about who's to say you weren't robbing the kingdom for just such a time as this.
Mm-hmm.
And who's to say that this good just didn't have to be wrong. You know, if you didn't believe in God, you would think this would be sure to cool button.
As I said last week, there's just too many coincidences, because God is working in the background to bring about the purpose he has for his people in the Persian Empire.
And they prayed very.
Yes. Yeah, fashion. Yeah.
And it's very
Johnny.
interesting to me that Esther and Mordecai, even though she was in the harem and was supposed to be kept away from people and
Everybody except for the eunuchs and the king.
right, but that she and Mordecai were in perfect communication.
Well, they relayed the messages to each other through these eunuchs. Yeah, those were the
But
messengers.
still, to have that person to be able to cause them to be able to perfectly communicate.
Yeah.
That's really what stands out in this whole book.
Okay, yeah, if they didn't have a means of communication, she and Mordecai and all the Jews are dead, as good as dead. So the king says, this is a great injustice that's been done to Mordecai. He asked his aides in the royal throne room, who's here that we can see? Is anybody here? Don't tell them what time of the night it was. We don't know. It could have been 4 in the morning, could have been 7 in the morning, it doesn't say. But who's in the court that I can carry this out and get Mordecai the honor that he is due? And just by coincidence, guess who's standing out, and we'll call it the vestibule, waiting to see the king, to ask the king for permission to hang Mordecai on this 75-foot gallows he built that same night. Who is it? Haman just happens to be standing there, and they tell the king, well, Haman's out here, call him in here. Call him in here, because he's just the man, he's second in command. He can get this taken care of. Haman goes in, but before he could even make his request, about what he was standing out in the court, in the vestibule for, Xerxes summoned him to the throne to answer an important question. Apparently the king wanted to consult any high-ranking official he could find, and Haman happened to be the most available man at the time. And he asked Haman, Haman, what do you think ought to be done for the man that the king wants to honor? How would you do it? And Haman's mind is going just like this, and he thinks what?
It's him.
He's talking about me. He's going to honor me. So he thinks of the ways that he would want to be honored. First, I want the honoree to wear a royal robe that the king has already worn. Oh my goodness. I want him to ride on a royal steed, carrying a royal crown on the horse, and I want this honoree of the king to be paraded throughout the city, and everybody give him the adulation and respect and honor that he is due these long 5 years after this was done. Well, the king stunned in verse 10 and horrified Haman. He charged Haman to honor Mordecai the Jew with this honor. I like your idea, Haman. It's a great idea. And I want you to take care of this today, this very day, and see that Mordecai is honored after this long lapse of time.
So he knew that Mordecai was a Jew.
Ma'am?
He knew that Mordecai was a Jew.
Yes.
So at some point he thought, oh, I'll just sit all the Jews should be highlighted. If you need, he doesn't say it, does he?
No, he knew Mordecai was a Jew, and he was so angry at him, he wanted him and all of his people.
No, I mean the king.
He didn't know which people.
The king.
Oh, yes. The king said, I mean, for him to take the robe and the horse is suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew.
Yeah.
Says to the king. So, do you think his brain just went like this instead of like this?
I don't know how Haman's brain worked.
I mean, Xerxes.
Xerxes.
Xerxes. Oh, okay.
Haman
Mine's
didn't
working that
specify.
way. Sir?
Haman did not specify.
No, he didn't say which people.
King Xerxes who these people were.
That he was going
He
to.
said there's a certain people
Yeah.
in verse 8 of chapter 3.
Yeah.
I don't think Xerxes even knew, nor did he really care.
No, that's right. He didn't know, he didn't care. He didn't care.
He said, hey, that's what you want to do, go ahead. You don't even have to pay for it, but go ahead. Here's my ring, sign it, go, do whatever you want.
Right. And he's going to do that again.
So Xerxes probably didn't know.
Yes, sir.
He hit the nail on the head.
Oh, okay. Okay, very good.
Well, thank you. I got one more comment about that. I love this. This is the visual of Haman leading Mordecai the Jew through this. I've got it visioned perfectly in my head, but I've got a book that's called Who's Who in the Bible, and it has a full-page color illustration of this, and the look on Haman's face that this artist has written is exactly what I've got in my mind. It is perfect.
Yeah,
That's one of my favorite illustrations.
I told Betty this afternoon I would love to have been standing there and see Haman's face when he says, okay, this is what you suggested, and I want you to do that for Mordecai the Jew today. I would love to have seen his face.
And the fact that not only this, as according to his word, the one that ended up being him, is to say before him, this is what is to be done for the man that the king honors.
Yes.
He's going to lead that horse with his
All
enemy
down.
on him, all through the down, and yelling out before him.
I wonder if he had.
I got to bring that picture in with you.
Yeah, that's,
It is perfect.
yeah, this is a classic of the worm turn.
It wasn't just any old horse, it was a royal.
It was a royal steed or stallion, yes, with a crown on it. And the Persian drawings from that era tell us that the king's horses were crowned on many occasions for special, oh my goodness, it's 8 o'clock. Well, we're just gonna have to wait and be in suspense for another week to see how this turns out. I'm sorry, at least I didn't run over. Any questions or comments on one of the greatest stories you ever read? Joni?
Where do we go next? We go back to this?
We go back to Ezra 7, because all of this happens between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7. And I'll give you a quick repeat. Ezra 6 ends with the completion of the temple at 515. And this one picks up about 478, Esther, and the next one picks up at chapter 7 of Ezra at 457. So yes, and then we'll go from there to Nehemiah. Anything else? Let us pray. Lord, for the way we work in your life, you work in our lives, we give you thanks, we give you honor, and we hopefully, Father, will give you our lives. We thank you for these wonderful stories of the history of the way that you guided your people and delivered them from evil. And help us to always remember that Jesus is the one now who will deliver us from the evil of sin. And help us to honor him every day that we live. In his blessed name, amen. Okay, next week we'll pick up with